On the morning of September 23, 1951, a Westminster hospital operating table had been dismantled, carried through the doors of Buckingham Palace, and reassembled in the Buell Room on the first floor. Emergency lighting had been specially installed. The operation was postponed by 1 day to complete the work. The surgeon who had insisted on it, a Welsh thoracic specialist named Sir Clement Price Thomas, understood that the procedure he was about to perform demanded every clinical advantage available. He was going to remove a human lung. The lung belonged to King George VI. Price Thomas was one of the foremost thoracic surgeons in the world. He had pioneered bronchial sleeve resections at Westminster Hospital. He had trained under Tudor Edwards and become, by general consensus, the man to call when the chest was the problem. On that Sunday morning in the Buell Room, with Westminster's equipment arrayed around a room more accustomed to diplomatic receptions, Price Thomas performed a left total pneumonectomy, the complete removal of the entire left lung, on a 55-year-old man who was also the King of England. The operation lasted 3 hours. That afternoon, the palace released a statement. The New York Times captured it the following day. The king's lung disease was guardedly diagnosed by his doctors as structural changes, producing a condition that gives cause for concern. Time magazine, in a contemporaneous report, described the procedure more bluntly. The surgery was to remove an obstruction, probably cancerous, but the king's doctors still wouldn't say. Structural changes, not cancer, not malignancy, not carcinoma. A 2021 peer-reviewed reassessment published in the journal Cardiovascular Pathology states the reality without euphemism. The king, a heavy smoker, underwent a left total pneumonectomy in September 1951 for what euphemistically was called structural abnormalities of his left lung, but what in reality was a carcinoma. The same study makes a second, equally significant finding. His physicians withheld this diagnosis from him, the public, and the medical profession. The word cancer never reached the king. His wife, however, almost certainly knew. This isn't a biography of George VI. It isn't a tribute, and it isn't a revisitation of the 1936 abdication. What follows is an examination of a specific act of historical manipulation, a 50-year campaign conducted with grief as its cover and a dead man's cigarettes as its buried evidence. The Queen Mother didn't merely mourn. She rewrote. She pointed at her brother-in-law and named him the cause of her husband's ruin, while the actual cause, a habit she shared, a habit she watched and enabled every single day of their married life, was never once mentioned in her grief. The prosecution begins with a room on the first floor of Buckingham Palace, September 23, 1951. Sir Clement Price Thomas was born in Abercarn, Monmouthshire, in November 1893. By 1951, he had spent nearly 3 decades building a reputation as one of the world's leading chest surgeons. He had been the first to perform a bronchial sleeve resection in 1947. He was meticulous. He was also, his colleagues noted, possessed of a certain dry confidence about his own abilities. When assisting surgeons moved to suture the wound after Price Thomas removed the cancerous lung, he reportedly told them he hadn't stitched up a chest in 25 years and had no intention of starting that day. The operation was a clinical success. The cancerous left lung was out. There was, however, a complication. Injury to the left recurrent laryngeal nerve affected the king's voice afterward. He was moved from the Buell Room back to his own bedroom. The palace announced structural changes, nothing more. 2 months later, on December 14, 1951, George VI knighted Price Thomas, conferring on him the Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order at Buckingham Palace. It was one of the king's first significant post-operative public acts. He was awarding the man who had removed his lung. He didn't, as far as the historical record shows, know that the lung had contained a carcinoma. He had been told he had a blockage. He had been told it was gone. This is the first fact the case rests on. The palace released a deliberate euphemism to the public, and the king's own physicians withheld his diagnosis from him specifically. The diagnosis was concealed from the king, who understood he was being treated for a lung blockage. The second fact follows immediately from the first. When a patient can't be told his diagnosis, the standard medical practice of the mid-20th century was to tell the family instead. This wasn't unusual, not a palace invention or a royal conspiracy. Oncology ethics literature confirms that in that era, withholding cancer diagnoses from patients while briefing their families was common practice across British medicine. The Penguin Monarch's biography of George VI notes that regarding medical information about the king, it was his wife's right to be informed of any development of importance. Multiple biographical summaries confirm the pattern. According to most accounts, even George wasn't told the extent of his illness, but the Queen knew. She knew the exact word the palace had refused to release. She knew what Price Thomas had found and removed. She knew the prognosis that came with a lung carcinoma in a 55-year-old heavy smoker in 1951. No surviving primary document explicitly records the moment royal physicians briefed Queen Elizabeth on the diagnosis, but the circumstantial case is overwhelming. She was the Queen. She was the appropriate recipient under both royal protocol and 1950s medical practice, and the months that followed suggest a woman managing the information of a dying man while presenting to him the fiction of a recovery. After the surgery, the king began privately instructing his staff to prepare Princess Elizabeth for the duties ahead. He understood, without the word, that something was badly wrong. He understood without being told what had been cut out of him, but he never had it confirmed. The Queen, as his wife, and as the one person the physicians would have briefed, had that knowledge exclusively. That asymmetry, she knew, he didn't, is the hinge of everything that came after. A 56-year-old man in declining health, stripped of one lung, was sent to his grave believing he had a chest condition that had been dealt with. The woman who sat beside him every day knew he was dying of cancer. She was the only person in his life who did. The king had been smoking since adolescence. His biographers are consistent on this point. Sarah Bradford's biography records the domestic detail with clinical precision. By breakfast, George VI had already smoked 2 cigarettes and 1 cigar, while by dinner he would often have got through 20 more cigarettes, which he smoked exhaling through his nose. Dennis Judd's biography documents that in the month before his lung surgery, the king was burning through between 25 and 30 cigarettes a day. Other sources push that figure higher toward the end of the war years, when the pressure was greatest. A Guardian interview with a thoracic surgery expert in 2015 put the case directly. "I think George VI should be on every cigarette packet because he had severe vascular disease in his legs and he had lung cancer, both caused by smoking." The vascular disease had already announced itself years earlier. By 1948, George VI had symptoms of peripheral vascular disease affecting his right leg, a condition directly associated with heavy tobacco use. In March 1949, he underwent a lumbar sympathectomy to improve circulation, his first significant surgery. Arteriosclerosis. A chain smoker's body beginning its long declaration of damage. He had been smoking that way for decades, and in all those decades, his wife had been in the room. Ben Pimlott's biography of Queen Elizabeth II contains a detail that deserves to sit plainly in the record. A scene of the king and queen, a cigarette passed in a long holder, taking turns. The Gilded Youth, a more recent group biography of royal childhoods, captures the Queen Mother's post-death reasoning in a passage that is, when you read it carefully, extraordinary. She seemed to think it had nothing to do with her husband's habit of smoking 50 cigarettes each day, and attributed his decline entirely to the burden imposed by the abdication. 50 cigarettes a day. She knew the number. She was present for the number. She watched him light every one of them. The Queen Mother was herself a smoker. Both were smokers. They smoked in the same rooms, at the same tables, through the same dinners and evenings at Glamis and Balmoral and Windsor. There was no moment across 30 years of marriage when the habit existed in isolation. It existed in a shared domestic space, witnessed and participated in, day after day after day. This isn't a minor detail, it's the central exhibit. Whatever theory the Queen Mother chose to advance about what killed her husband, she had watched the actual mechanism operating at close range for the better part of 3 decades. She had not suggested he stop. She had not, so far as the biographical record shows, urged any modification of the habit that was, quite visibly, destroying his vascular system and, eventually, filling his left lung with a carcinoma. The evidence simply does not support the image of a concerned wife alarmed by her husband's cigarette consumption. It supports the image of a shared habit, normalized and unchallenged, practiced alongside him from courtship to coffin. She wasn't a passive bystander to George VI's smoking. She was a participant. He died in his sleep at Sandringham House, Norfolk, in the early hours of February 6, 1952. His valet found him at approximately 7:30 in the morning. George VI was 56 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as coronary thrombosis. The previous day he had been shooting on the estate. He appeared, by the accounts of those around him, in good spirits. He retired to bed around 10 o'clock. Sometime in the night, his heart stopped. The 2021 pathologist's reassessment in cardiovascular pathology raises a different possibility. The continuation of hemoptysis, coughing blood, after the September 1951 pneumonectomy suggested to the reviewing physicians that the cancer had spread to the right lung. They proposed that the actual cause of death may have been a pulmonary embolus or a massive intrathoracic hemorrhage from a spreading carcinoma, rather than a primary coronary event. The official coronary thrombosis designation was an assumption made at the time based on his history of vascular disease. The cancer, which was still not named in any public communication, may well have killed him in a more direct way than the death certificate recorded. It was announced on BBC Radio at 11:15 that morning. Newsreader John Snagg: "It's with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement." The words were repeated every 15 minutes. The great Tom Bell at St. Paul's Cathedral tolled once a minute for 2 hours. The Sebastopol bell at Windsor Castle, rung only on a royal death, sounded 56 times, once for each year of his life. 304,000 people queued, at times for 4 miles, to pass through Westminster Hall where his coffin lay in state. And within days, the narrative frame was already in position. The abdication, the burden, the shy, suffering man thrust onto a throne he never wanted by a brother who chose a twice-divorced American woman over his duty. Press coverage from the days and weeks following his death consistently placed the 1936 abdication as the defining context of his life. He was framed as the unexpected king, the reluctant sovereign, the man who bore a crushing weight not of his own choosing. The language of sacrifice and martyrdom dominated the obituaries and tributes. George VI had endured. He had been broken by what Edward had done to him. This wasn't an accidental framing. The Queen Mother had spent 15 years building the foundation for it. The case that she actively seeded this narrative, rather than simply experiencing grief and letting the press draw its own conclusions, rests on the convergence of several documented patterns. First, the biographical record. The Dawn newspaper, drawing on multiple royal biographies, reported that the Queen Mother came to blame Edward for her husband's early death. believing George was never strong enough to bear the role that had been imposed on him. The Gilded Youth passage is, again, the sharpest encapsulation. She attributed everything to the abdication and dismissed the 50 cigarettes a day as irrelevant. This isn't just grief. This is a stated alternative causal theory, offered consistently across years and reported by multiple independent biographical sources. Second, the amplification chain. Sympathetic royal biographers, William Shawcross, who had full access to her personal papers for the authorized biography, Sarah Bradford, Robert Lacey, Elizabeth Longford, all reproduced and reinforced the abdication burden framework in their accounts of George VI's reign and death. Shawcross is the most significant figure here. As official biographer, he had access to her letters, her diaries, her private communications. His authorized account of her life and widowhood was shaped by the version of events she chose to provide. The narrative didn't just circulate, it was given institutional weight. Third, the absence of the alternative. No major royal biography of the post-war era prominently identified George VI's smoking as the primary cause of his death. The carcinoma was mentioned, but its implications weren't pursued. The abdication frame absorbed the public understanding of his decline. A Guardian surgeon calling in 2015 for George VI to appear on cigarette packaging was essentially a corrective to 50 years of narrative omission, 50 years during which the real cause had been structurally deprioritized in the official story of the king's death. The narrative worked because the Queen Mother was in the best possible position to sustain it. She was grief itself, personified. She was the widow of a beloved wartime king. She was the grandmother of the new monarch. No journalist and no biographer with any access to the palace was going to challenge her on the subject of her husband's cigarettes while she was arranging his funeral. And she understood this. She was, by all contemporary accounts, one of the most politically intuitive members of the 20th century British royal family. This wasn't an accident of mourning. Grief was the instrument. The abdication was the argument. And there was a very specific target. The connection between the abdication narrative and the ongoing treatment of Edward, Duke of Windsor, and his wife Wallis is where the cover story reveals its second function. Blaming the abdication for George VI's death wasn't only a way to redirect attention from the cigarettes. It was a way to turn Edward into a murderer by proxy, permanently. Every time the Queen Mother explained that the unexpected burden of the crown had destroyed her husband's health and shortened his life, she was also saying something about Edward, that he had done this, that his choice in December 1936 to put his personal desires above his duty had imposed an impossible weight on a man constitutionally unsuited for monarchy, and that weight had killed him. This framing had immediate and durable consequences for how the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were treated by the royal family after 1952. The Duchess of Windsor was never granted the style Her Royal Highness. When George VI created the Dukedom of Windsor in 1937, the letters patent explicitly excluded any wife or children from bearing royal styles. This wasn't accidental. It was, as one royal historian has put it, technically illegal. And the Queen Mother was, by multiple biographical accounts, the primary sustained obstacle to any subsequent resolution of the HRH question. Multiple sources confirm she refused to use Wallis Simpson's name at all. She referred to her consistently as that woman. Sally Bedell Smith's biography of George VI and Elizabeth confirms that the most serious grievance Edward carried for the rest of his life was the unwillingness of George and Elizabeth, as well as the Dowager Queen Mary, to receive Wallis. He died in Paris on May 28, 1972, and even at the end, the question of the HRH title had not been resolved. The two figures spent the bulk of their adult lives in effective exile from official royal life. They weren't invited to major royal events. Wallis wasn't received. The Duke returned to England for funerals, George VI in February 1952, Queen Mary's in 1953. But the reunion was always on the monarchy's terms, brief, constrained, and loaded. Not until 1967 were Edward and Wallis invited to attend an official public ceremony with other members of the royal family. Now consider the structure of what the Queen Mother had achieved. She had advanced a narrative that cast Edward as the cause of her husband's destruction. That narrative justified at every turn his and Wallis's exclusion from the family's life. Every social snub, every withheld title, every closed door was implicitly backed by the claim, they killed him. His selfishness imposed a burden that broke George. How could the family receive the woman at whose feet the king's death could be laid? The abdication narrative wasn't just grief management. It was a long-running justification for a long-running punishment. The Queen Mother had found a way to win the dynastic argument against Edward and Wallis permanently, not through constitutional maneuvering, but through the shaping of historical memory. She killed two birds with one story. The lie worked because the truth was almost impossible to believe. Not because the medical reality was complex. The medical reality was straightforward. George VI had lung cancer, caused by decades of heavy smoking, and it killed him at 56. The 2021 peer-reviewed assessment makes this explicit. The tobacco connection was medically established. The 1951 British doctors' study by Dahl and Hill, published with notable timing in October 1951, the month after the surgery, had formally established the causal link between smoking and lung cancer. That connection was emerging in medical literature precisely as Price Thomas was removing the king's lung. The lie worked because the public already had a completely different story available, one they had been watching in real time for 15 years. George VI's stammer was known to the nation. He had begun working with the Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue in 1926, after his closing speech at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, an ordeal for both him and his listeners. Logue operated outside mainstream medical practice and developed an intensive therapeutic relationship with the Duke of York. It was Logue standing in the room during the wartime Christmas broadcasts. It was Logue working through breathing exercises with the king before every major speech he dreaded giving. The wartime broadcasts are the most vivid example. The nation heard the king's voice straining against his stammer during the gravest months of the Second World War. They heard the effort. They understood, without being told, that each broadcast represented an act of will against a condition that caused him genuine suffering. Then there was the abdication itself, which the public had absorbed as the founding trauma of the reign. George VI had not prepared for the throne. He had not wanted it. The night before the abdication, he wrote in his diary that he broke down and sobbed like a child when he told his mother what was happening. He was described by courtiers as shy, introverted, physically fragile-seeming, practically unsuited for public life. He felt the burden acutely and was documented expressing it. The Penguin Monarch's biography records that he had been overwhelmed by the pressures of the abdication. He had said so himself. So when the Queen Mother advanced the idea that the stress of an unexpected kingship, imposed by an irresponsible brother, had broken a man ill-suited to bear it, she wasn't building a fiction from nothing. She was building on an architecture of public perception that already existed. The British people had watched this man struggle with his own body, his own voice, his own fitness for the job. The story of a fragile, suffering, reluctant king, tormented by duty, wasn't invented in February 1952. It had been unfolding since December 1936. The abdication stress narrative was credible because it matched what people already saw. The Queen Mother understood this. She knew the public image of her husband more precisely than anyone. She had, in part, helped construct it. The image of the martyred, duty-bound, reluctant king, who stayed in London during the Blitz, who broadcast to the nation despite his stammer, who gave everything he had to a role thrust upon him, was both genuine and, in the context of the cover story, extraordinarily convenient. The truth, that a man burned through 25 to 30 unfiltered cigarettes a day for 3 decades and paid the predictable biological price, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a story about noble suffering. It was a story about a habit, shared and unremarked in a household, that silently deposited carcinogens into a lung every single day until the lung had to come out. That story had no martyrdom in it. The abdication story had an enormous amount of martyrdom in it. And the British public in 1952 wasn't looking for an accountable cause. They were looking for a reason to mourn. The Queen Mother gave them one. She pointed at her brother-in-law and grieved. There is one more layer to this, and it requires careful handling. Royal biographers, including those with access to palace figures, have noted a persistent shadow over the relationship between Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and the Prince of Wales before she married Prince Albert. One book, Queen and Consort, refers to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon as someone who had previously turned him down, describing a prior dynamic with Edward that predates her marriage to George in 1923. The precise nature of that dynamic isn't documented in any publicly available primary source, and the royal archives haven't confirmed it. What circulates in royal biographical literature is more in the register of inference than documentation. That there was something between Elizabeth and Edward that didn't proceed, and that she married Prince Albert, the less glamorous, the less desired, the stammer and the shy disposition, some time after. The specific claim that Edward explicitly rejected her, or told her to walk away, is a deeply embedded piece of popular royal history. This audience knows it. Many take it as settled fact. It isn't. There is no letter, no diary entry, no archive-confirmed scene that documents an explicit rejection. But the shadow exists, and it's worth noting what it would mean if it were even partially true. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had turned down Prince Albert at least twice before finally accepting him in January 1923. She was reluctant by her own account because of what royal life would demand. The man she eventually married wasn't the most prominent of the Windsor brothers. He was the stammer and the shyness and the knock-knees and the duodenal ulcer. His elder brother was the one who set men's fashion, who was called the most photographed celebrity in the world, who commanded the room. If there was personal history with Edward, even of the ambiguous variety that royal biographers dance around, it would recast the nature of the Queen Mother's lifelong hostility. It would mean her vendetta wasn't purely constitutional. It would mean the loathing she directed at Edward and Wallace, the refusal to speak Wallace's name, the orchestration of their social exclusion, the decades of sustained contempt, wasn't entirely born of righteous anger at a man who abandoned his duty. It would mean some of it was deeply, personally old. That is an inference. It isn't a documented fact, but it's the inference that every serious royal biographer edges toward when they write about the Queen Mother's attitude toward her brother-in-law, and it deserves to be named plainly as the possibility it's. What is documented is the lifelong hostility itself. What is documented is her referring to Wallace only as that woman, refusing for over 50 years to speak her name. What is documented is the sustained campaign to deny the HRH title, to keep the Windsors out of official life, to ensure that Edward's exile was maintained rather than ever quietly resolved. What is documented is that she turned the narrative of her husband's death into the most powerful weapon available: grief, deployed publicly, pointed at a specific target, sustained for decades. Whether she was also nursing a 50-year personal grievance beneath the constitutional one, That is the shadow. It can't be confirmed, but it makes the whole shape of her conduct considerably more legible. Price Thomas, the surgeon who removed the king's lung, was a lifelong chain smoker himself. His biography notes he carried at least 50 cigarettes in his pocket daily. In 1964, he underwent a lobectomy for his own lung cancer, performed by Charles Drew, the same surgeon who had assisted him in the king's operation 13 years earlier. He died in March 1973. The operating table from the Boole Room procedure is on display at Westminster Hospital. The ECG machine used that day is in the British Oxygen Company Museum. George VI was awarded Price Thomas the KCVO on December 14, 1951, believing, so far as the record shows, that the surgeon had fixed a blockage. He died 54 days later. Now, draw the lines and see what they form. September 23, 1951. A lung carcinoma is removed from the king's chest. He isn't told what was found. The palace tells the country he had structural changes. His wife is, in all probability, told the truth, because that is what physicians did in that era, and because her right to be informed was recognized protocol. February 6, 1952. The king dies at Sandringham at 56, found dead in his bed by his valet. The official cause is coronary thrombosis. Modern pathologists believe the cancer may have already spread to his right lung. February 1952, onward. Obituaries and tributes frame his life through the abdication. The stress narrative dominates. The Queen Mother, as the authorized voice of the king's private suffering, confirms and amplifies this understanding across decades. The abdication killed him. The burden imposed by an irresponsible brother was what destroyed a man unfit for monarchy. The Gilded Youth, drawing on biographical sources, records her view plainly. She seemed to think it had nothing to do with her husband's habit of smoking 50 cigarettes each day. 50 cigarettes. Every day. For decades. In rooms she also occupied. Alongside a husband she watched exhale smoke through his nose by dinner time. With a knowledge, from September 1951 onward, that this specific habit had produced a carcinoma requiring the removal of an entire lung. The smoking cancer link wasn't a mystery available only to medical researchers in 1951. The Dahl and Hill study was published that October. But even before the formal study, it had been medically observable for years that heavy smokers developed lung disease at elevated rates. George VI had peripheral vascular disease by 1948. The connection between his habit and his deteriorating circulatory system wasn't invisible to the physicians who had been treating him. The Queen Mother wasn't a physician, but she wasn't ignorant. She was one of the most informed private individuals in the British monarchy, shrewd, well-connected, politically aware. When Price Thomas removed her husband's lung, she was briefed. She knew what a carcinoma was. She knew what it meant. And she spent the rest of her long life, she died in March 2002 at 101, ensuring that the story the public told about her husband's death was a different one. There is a counter-argument that deserves a moment's examination, because it isn't a frivolous one. George VI himself believed the abdication had broken him. His diary entry the night before the abdication is raw. He sobbed like a child when he told his mother what was happening. He felt overwhelmed by the pressures. He had expressed this throughout his reign. If the Queen Mother was advancing a narrative that her husband himself had lived inside, if she was, in part, simply reflecting what he had told her, then calling it a lie is too simple. It isn't too simple. Here is why. The abdication imposed psychological stress. Psychological stress didn't cause a lung carcinoma. It may have increased cigarette consumption, but the cigarettes caused the cancer, not the stress. George VI's own felt experience of his reign as a burden does not alter the biological chain of events. He smoked heavily from before the abdication. He smoked heavily during the abdication. He smoked heavily after it. He was smoking 25 to 30 a day in the month before Price Thomas cut him open. The abdication didn't put those cigarettes in his hand. Nicotine addiction and a habit formed over decades did. The Queen Mother took her husband's psychological experience, genuine, documented, real, and used it to construct a causal story that was biologically false. The mechanism she pointed to, stress, duty, the burden of unexpected monarchy, had no pathway to lung carcinoma. The mechanism she refused to point to, daily inhalation of tobacco smoke, shared domestically for 30 years, is the well-documented actual cause. She wasn't lying about his suffering. She was lying about what killed him. She built the argument on what?